Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lane Calcutt from 9 News, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, the man they call Albo. Anthony Albanese has represented the inner west of Sydney as a member for Grainler since 1996. Following the election of the Rudd Labor government in 2007, he became the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government and Leader of the House of Reps. In 2012, he was named Infrastructure Minister of the Year by the London-based publication Infrastructure Investor. In June 2013, he became Deputy Prime Minister and also took on the additional responsibility as Minister for Broadband, Communications and the Digital Economy. In opposition, he has served the ALP as Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, geez, that's a terrible word, isn't it? Transport, Cities and Regional Development and the Shadow Minister for Tourism. In May last year, he was elected unopposed as a leader of the Australian Labor Party. That's not a bad CV for someone who still thinks Greg Inglis should have played for New South Wales. Anyway, please welcome Anthony Albanese.
Well, thanks very much, Lane. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I acknowledge my colleagues who are here, Julie Collins, who's the Shadow Minister for Ageing, the Queensland team led by Jim Chalmers, my Shadow Treasurer, Terry Butler, Graham Perrott, Annika Wells, Nita Green, Shane Newman, Anthony Chisholm, Murray Watt and Milton Dick. It's fantastic to have your support here today. When I look at older Australians, I see the generation that built this nation, the generation that built our economy and shaped our society, the generation that did the hard yards. They have shown aspiration at its most fundamental. Aspiration not just for themselves, but for a better life for their children, for their grandchildren, their neighbours, their community and indeed their country. In them I see what I hope we all see, the strength and the spirit of our nation. You see it everywhere you go. During this terrible bushfire season I visited many fire zones to see directly what was going on. One was Cuddly Creek in the Adelaide Hills. Among the volunteers there with the Country Fire Service was Mike. He's 82. He has been in the service for no less than 57 years. Still making his contribution, still doing administration work for the CFS, and importantly, sharing his knowledge with cadets who are all there from the age of 10. He's still doing his bit for the organisation and the community that he loves. And those young people are getting one of the most priceless gifts of all, the wisdom drawn from a long life. What an absolute inspiration he is. For so many Australians, their later years are an incredible opportunity. Some travel, some perfect their golf swing, some throw themselves into community work. Indeed, they're the lifeblood of our local clubs, associations and fire brigades. Without them, civil society would simply grind to a halt. And so many throw their love and energy into their families, not least their grandchildren. But having done their bit to build the country into what it is today, they're not going to let it fall apart, not on their watch. As with the rest of society, we cannot speak of older Australians as a homogenous group. Older Australians live in our regions, in our outer suburbs, in our inner cities. After long lives of working and providing for their families and contributing to the nation, older Australians deserve a fulfilling and secure retirement. If we acknowledge the importance of our older Australians, we need to make sure that their later years are good years. That's why in government, Labor will move quickly to develop and implement a positive ageing strategy. It will outline a plan to help Australians in their final years of paid work, to build the nest egg that will let them retire when and how they want. A plan that makes sure that when Australians do retire, they have access to quality health care. that makes sure that our urban environments work for them, that gives all older Australians a roof over their head, that lets them access quality aged care when the need arises. They are, after all, our grandparents, our parents, our brothers and sisters, and eventually us. For their part, the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government has no strategy, no plan to deal with the challenges or to reap the benefits of an ageing population. Current policy settings are simply inadequate. Australia's lifestyle has long been the envy of the world, but when it comes to supporting our ageing population, we fall far short of our reputation. As well as addressing the material needs of older Australians, our positive ageing strategy will above all confront the way that we as a society have come to view ageing, a cultural shift away from reverence for our elders that has accelerated under this government. The government talks of the elderly as though they are a burden. An economic time bomb is what Josh Frydenberg has spoken about. The same person who last week, when we raised questions about aged care, called it a distraction. When Scott Morrison was the Treasurer, he tried cutting the age pension in every budget, and he succeeded in cutting it for 370,000 Australians in 2015 by changes to the assets test. The failure to take timely action on deeming rates has reduced the income for older Australians. And this is a government that is also presiding over an economy characterised by stagnant wages that hit older workers and undermine their retirement incomes. While it's typical for this government to have no plan to tackle the big challenges that we face as a nation, the demographic trajectory is clear and irreversible. In 1927, just 5% of Australia's population was aged over 65. In 2017, that figure was 15%. But by 2057, it's projected to be 22%, more than 1 in every 5 Australians. Labor knows there is more we can and should be doing for older Australians. Our older years must be good years. Just as Australians are living longer, they're staying in the workforce longer. For some, this is out of necessity. Others, of course, simply love what they do. Their job is an intrinsic part of their identity, of who they are. But it isn't possible for everyone. Older workers in blue-collar industries shouldn't be expected to put in even more years of hard physical slog. It's also concerning that a growing number of mature-age workers can't get the amount of work that they seek. Today, over 170,000 Australians aged between 55 and 64 are on unemployment benefits, just when they should be building their nest egg. For too many Australians over the age of 45, if they become unemployed, they'll struggle to get another job and instead spiral down towards a pretty lean retirement. The announcement by Holden this week, in response to the government explicitly daring them to leave Australia and leave those jobs behind, has got to be viewed in this context. The answer for some of these Australians is to upgrade their skills, which underscores the urgency of rebuilding our TAFEs and our vocational education and training sector. And that's why in the first of these vision statements in Perth, I announced a future Labor government would establish Jobs and Skills Australia to drive improved outcomes in this sector. But having the right skills has not always proven to be enough. Age discrimination persists. Prime Minister Julia Gillard tackled this by appointing an Age Discrimination Commissioner. But government cannot legislate the cultural change that is essential. Ageism needs to be called out by each and every one of us. Employers in particular must play their part. They should value them, they should retain them, they should hire them. According to Deloitte Access Economics, a 3%, just 3, increase in workforce participation by Australians aged over 55 would generate a $33 billion boost to the economy each and every year. Volunteering is great, but to build a stronger economy, we must harness the talents of everybody, and that includes older Australians, who are such sources of wisdom and experience for their employers, but also for their co-workers in the workplace. When the time comes, everyone has a different vision of retirement, but every Australian should have one thing in common. They should have dignity in that retirement. The crucial ingredient is the retirement income system. On this, Labor's record over more than a century speaks for itself. Way back in 1908, the Labor government of Andrew Fisher, a great Queenslander, introduced the old age pension, ensuring that for the first time, working Australians could retire with dignity. We were one of the first nations in the world to do it. In more recent times, the Rudd Labor government delivered the most significant boost to the age pension in a generation, lifting 1 million older Australians out of poverty. But the system needs improvement. Older Australians should not have to wait months for their pension to be processed, nor should people be left on hold for hours trying to talk to an actual human being at Centrelink. The pension is, of course, just one pillar of the retirement income system. The second pillar was built by the Hawke-Keating Labor government, that is, universal superannuation. This further extended Australians' financial independence in retirement, extending over time access to the financial security that was once the preserve of business executives and high-ranking public servants. Our political opponents don't share our aspirations for our fellow Australians. That's why we established an entrenched superannuation to empower Australians and bolster their independence. Superannuation was never, ever designed to be a mere safety net. We established it to give working people a fuller and richer retirement. It's also, of course, working for the Australian economy. $3 trillion worth of superannuation savings is being invested both here and abroad, creating jobs, building infrastructure, ensuring Australians get more of the wealth of our great country. Like Medicare, universal superannuation is a great Labor legacy. Sadly, support for it is not universal. At the moment, we are witnessing an unholy coalition attacking the increase in the superannuation guarantee. They want to see super wound back, or some of them abolished. The prescriptions of ACOS and others play into the hands of the Liberal and National parties. The parties of trickle-down economics, lower wage growth and less security. Labor supports the legislated increase in the superannuation guarantee to 12% by 2025. With economic growth and productivity, you can have both higher super and higher wages. If the theory was correct, then what you would have seen with wages flatlining the way it is at the moment, you would have seen that not occur given the freeze that was done in the superannuation guarantee increase. But the opposite, of course, has occurred. So having established the universal superannuation system, we're not going to stand by and see it chipped away. In fact, we want to make it better. Women retire with just half the average super of men, and many have none at all. This imbalance must be addressed. Another key to a good retirement is good health. The great news is we're all living longer. Over the past century, we've added 2 decades and now have an average life expectancy of 82 years. Our healthcare system must meet the demands that come with that change, and at present it just isn't. Older Australians are facing record costs and waiting times. Take dental care. Many older Australians are entitled to dental services in the public system, but the government has cut public dental funding by hundreds of millions of dollars a year and is set to exit completely in July. As a result, older Australians are forced to wait months or even years for public dental care. Here in Queensland, the average wait is 21 months. Often that means months of pain, of stigma and of shame. For many, private dental care simply isn't affordable. The government's own data shows that every year, more than 200,000 older Australians can't see a dentist because it's too expensive. So it's no surprise that 1 in every 2 have gum disease and 1 in every 5 have no natural teeth. That's why Labor went to the last election with a pensioner dental plan. We call upon today the government to follow our lead. But dental, of course, is not the only area where older Australians are struggling to access healthcare. Out-of-pocket costs and private health insurance premiums are at record highs. So are waiting times for cataract surgery, hip and knee replacements, and other so-called elective surgeries. And with fewer GPs and registered nurses now working within residential aged care facilities, many older Australians struggle to get even basic health services. We must respond to these existing healthcare challenges at the same time as planning for the emerging ones. The silver lining of our longer lives bring with it the cloud of diseases that in earlier times were unlikely to live long enough to experience. Dementia, for one, now affects nearly 500,000 Australians right now. It is the second leading cause of death, but the leading cause of death for women. And of course, it sweeps up the families and loved ones of sufferers. Few things can induce such a sense of helplessness as watching dementia make its remorseless inroads into the mind of a loved one, taking one memory after another. Our Shadow Minister for Carers, Emma McBride, came to understand dementia as a granddaughter and daughter caring for her grandmother and father. For 6 years, she helped care for her dad, an old mate of mine, Grant McBride. When she was elected to Parliament, she made a promise to her mum, Barbara, that she would do everything she could to help people living with dementia and their carers. Her mum, I think, put it beautifully. She said that in caring for someone with dementia, you learn that they are much more than their memories. Unless there is a medical breakthrough, it is expected in the next 40 years that number affected will increase to over 1 million. But as we wait for that breakthrough, the experience of dementia can be softened. Emma tells me that one of the best ways to improve the life of someone with dementia, and by extension their family, is to have dementia-friendly spaces in our communities. It allows those living with dementia to remain connected to family and friends. It is encouraging that work has begun on Australia's first dementia village, Korongi Dementia Village in Glenorchy, one of the suburbs of Hobart. It gives residents a sense of normality while keeping them safe. They can go shopping, dine at the restaurant, cook their own dinner. It's about two things: humanity and dignity. Ideas like this are what we need to look at if our healthcare system is to keep pace with demographic change. Growing old, of course, challenges in other ways as well. When we think about how to best support older Australians, we must apply more than a purely financial lens. Clearly, the physical environment matters. Urban design and housing must help older Australians remain in their homes and in their communities if they choose. But it also must be adaptable. Governments must work together on long-term planning to ensure our transport networks, homes, shops and community facilities are accessible and fit for the ageing. This includes culturally appropriate facilities and support services, such as the Vietnamese information session that I visited yesterday in Inala with Milton Dick and Jim Chalmers. A great day. We met Mrs. No, 103 years young and going very, very strong indeed. Smart urban design brings people together, making it easier for people to know their neighbours and strengthen their sense of community. Older Australians are increasingly experiencing loneliness. As they get older, their children may have moved cities and their social networks, which are critical to their well-being, aren't always there. There are alternative visions. We can look at Toyama in Japan. It's adopted the principle of a compact city, eliminating the urban sprawl that is such an ingredient in isolation amongst older people. People live close to each other with good access to services and public transport. They have a more ready sense of community. I want us to build a society that sees ageing as a positive stage of life. I'm sure many of you watch the ABC program, Old People's Home for 4-Year-Olds. If you haven't seen it, look it up on iView. It made me laugh and made me cry. But it also made me imagine a future of intergenerational care. Imagine a future where we co-locate aged care facilities, including day respites, with kindergartens and preschools. Day respite for our elderly is a missing piece of the puzzle. For many families, they want mum or dad to stay at home or live with them, but they worry about the long days when they are at work. Imagine being able to drop your child and grandmother off at the same location with the full knowledge that they're going to have a great day together and with other members of the community. With activities such as shown on that show, from trips to the beach to visits of dogs and ducks and all the other activity that occurs, making Play-Doh, getting it all over each other, dancing and moving, where the show shows people participating in dance, which is really exercise without even knowing it, and enjoying it, being encouraged by the 4-year-olds saying to the elderly, come on, you can do it. The benefits of intergenerational care are immense. It can help our elderly re-engage with the world, minimise their isolation and the effects of their health issues. Smart urban design also helps mitigate the worst effects of extreme weather events. Heat waves have a particularly significant impact on older Australians who are more susceptible to heat stress. I've often quoted Jan Girl, an architect who highlights the importance of not just buildings themselves, but also the spaces in between, incorporating greater vegetation, making the most of waterways, considering thermal design, ensuring shading in public areas. That's what makes our cities cooler and more comfortable and improves mental health. Our housing must also support an ageing population. It must be well designed, adaptable and energy efficient, so as to cut the electricity bills that make many older Australians shy away from heating and air conditioning. And we also need more affordable social housing, not least for older women who are more at risk of homelessness, many for the first time in their lives. Right now, I think it's an indictment that the fastest group of homeless Australians, in terms of growing, are women aged between 65 and 74. We can do better than that. Old age isn't synonymous with aged care, but for some older Australians it will become necessary in their later years. But the truth is our aged care sector is broken. Look no further than the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, where desperate families and exhausted, under-resourced aged care workers are telling their stories. The Royal Commission's interim report described Australia's aged care system as, and I quote, cruel and harmful, shocking, all too often unsafe and seemingly uncaring. They found that, again I quote, many of the cases of deficiencies or outright failings in aged care were known to the regulators before coming to public attention. Think about that. The regulators knew about it before it became public. There have been 250,000 instances of substandard aged care reported in the last 5 years. How can we let this happen? For too long, governments have turned a blind eye. It is a collective failure. There's been a lack of reform and investment in aged care, in both home care and residential aged care. For those Australians who can and want to stay in their homes, a home care package provides the support that they need. But there are now more than 100,000 Australians on the waiting list for such a package. Older Australians waiting for their high-level package are waiting almost 3 years to get the care that they have been approved for. In just 2 years, nearly 30,000 older Australians have died waiting for what was their approved package to be put in place. 30,000. The median waiting time for older Australians going into residential aged care has grown by more than 100 days under the Liberals and Nationals, from just over 1 month to a 5-month wait. At the Royal Commission, we've heard stories of degradation, suffering, abuse, neglect and systemic failure. We heard that up to half of older Australians in residential aged care are malnourished. Over half. People are literally starving. It is shameful that in a wealthy country like ours this is happening. We heard that the major quality and safety issues are, quote again, inadequate prevention and management of wounds, sometimes leading to septicemia and death. And aged care residents often, quote again from the Royal Commission, sitting or lying in urine or faeces. This is what Josh Frydenberg says is a distraction. Part of the answer to this crisis must lie in our aged care workforce, those we trust to care for our most vulnerable, our parents, our grandparents, eventually ourselves. There are too few aged care workers and they are paid too little. They've begged the government to do something. Well, we're listening. Our aged care workers need proper pay and proper training. The aged care workforce must also be able to provide culturally and linguistically appropriate care for the sort of community members that I met in Inala from the Vietnamese Australian community just yesterday. Staffing numbers, qualifications, skills mix and experience all affect the ability of aged care workers to provide safe, quality care. Under a Labor government, solving this will be one of the major priority tasks for Jobs and Skills Australia, as I outlined in my first vision statement. It will be tasked with strengthening workforce planning, particularly in the growing sectors of our economy like aged care. How do we match up the future jobs with training and skills? At the end of last year, after the shocking interim report was handed down, the government's response wasn't much, but one of the responses was to announce its plan to privatise aged care assessments. Aged Care Minister Richard Colbeck even claimed the privatisation was supported by the Royal Commission, a claim that drew a public correction from the Royal Commission chair. Now, the first interaction that the elderly and their families have with the aged care system is through an aged care assessment, or ACAT. It's the first step to getting either a home care package or entering a residential aged care facility. Our aged care system is broken, but this is one area which is not broken. And this government wants to make it worse by subjecting this process to the indifference of the market. There's a role for markets, but they have no conscience. The government must abandon its plans immediately. It must act on the Royal Commission recommendations. Our elderly deserve nothing less. Now, I began this speech with an inspirational older Australian, so let me finish with another one. More specifically, an older Queenslander, Everil Compton. He's a passionate advocate for nation-building projects, which is how I got to know him, and for those who've made those projects happen, the nation builders with whom our older generations abound. On his Twitter biography, Everil describes himself as, quote, a young Aussie in his 80s. When those of us in this room hopefully reach our 80s as part of our extended youth, we can only hope to have a small fraction of Everil's energy. Labor will have that energy to carry out our positive plans for older Australians. I grew up in council housing. I have a deep appreciation of the difference that governments can make to the lives of Australians. Having seen what my mum went through in her later years, I want to be able to make a difference for older Australians now and the older Australians of the future. Mum raised me on her own. She was a strong woman with a great mind and a huge heart. She gave so much, but she experienced years of sickness and struggle. She died too young at just 65. If Mum had got the care that she needed earlier, her later years would have been so much better. I don't want us to all shrug our shoulders and resign ourselves to this simply being the way that it is, that change is all too hard, because we have in our hands the power to make a difference and to seize the opportunities that are before us. I went into politics to make a difference every day not to just occupy the space. The change and the challenges the future holds can be unsettling, but we also see the opportunities as long as we are prepared for them. And this is all a part of Labor's vision that we're outlining in these vision statements. With planning, vision and just some of the spirit that defines our older Australians, we can indeed take care of the future and ensure that it's a better future for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Albo, for your speech. And as one racing towards retirement, it was quite comforting knowing that you got my back. Thank you for that.
We're all hopefully getting there.
We are.
It's just a matter of when.
How good is Queensland, by the way?
Queensland's fantastic. I love Queensland for 362 nights a year and 365 days. I'll leave you to work out the other three.
We got it. Well, it wasn't so great last May, as you well know, when basically Queenslanders and elderly Queenslanders gave Labor a flogging. They were sitting on the verandas with the proverbial baseball bats, largely over the so-called retiree tax, whether that was a scare campaign or not. It was complex, it was hard to defend. Is this Labor rebooting their older Australian policy? Is it a reach out to them to draw them back into the Labor tent?
Well, we want to represent all Australians, regardless of where they live, whether they're in the cities or the regions, regardless of their age, their gender. We see it as an essential part of our commitment to social justice and building on our record. It is Labor governments that introduced the age pension. It is Labor governments that introduced universal superannuation. It is Labor governments that introduced Medicare and defended it and built on it. It is Labor that made commitments in the lead up to the last election that would make a practical difference to people's lives, such as in dental care. So we see it as a natural move going forward. We also see that the government doesn't really have a plan. They've got this Royal Commission, which they don't talk about. We think this is a major issue. We have an ageing of our population that is a challenge for our economy as well as for our society, that impacts individuals but also impacts families. And we think there hasn't been enough discussion of it, frankly, and today is a very conscious decision. This is the first of the vision statements aimed at social policy, because we see it as an absolute priority.
You talk about, or you referred to Josh Frydenberg's reference to the ageing population being an economic time bomb. You obviously don't see it that way. You might see it as some sort of boom, getting the elderly back into the workforce and everything else. And given your commitment to implement all the recommendations from the Royal Commission, it is hugely expensive, is it not? Look, how do you find that? Where do you find the money for that?
There's a cost, yes, but it's also a matter of a priority. And is it acceptable that half the people in aged care are malnourished? No. Is it acceptable that people, 30,000 people, over 2 years die, have been approved for home care and don't get it? No. If the answer to that is no, then you've got a responsibility to act. And you've got a responsibility as well to recognise that, yes, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. The examples that I gave about best practice in terms of the ABC show and other examples that are there mean that if you do things in the right way, quite often you find that you actually save money. One of the things about appropriate care for people in their later years is it actually keeps them healthy. One of the things that activity...
So there are savings to be made.
Absolutely. That activity shows, and they have doctors commenting during the ABC show, is that if you get the elderly to sing and dance and enjoy things, it stimulates the brain, it makes them less susceptible to strokes and to acute health events, and that presents a saving for the healthcare system. So if we do this right, I'm convinced that we can get good outcomes, that it's not all downside. It's a matter of looking in an optimistic way for how we can acknowledge the challenge which is there, but come out of it with a positive agenda, hence our commitment today to a positive ageing strategy.
Just indulge me before we go to the gallery members, a question from my Canberra colleagues, and you mentioned Holden. Given the fact that the luxury car tax was imposed largely to protect Holden and Ford, is it now time, and there is a push within the coalition to do away with that, is it now time to ditch that?
Well, we certainly haven't examined that, but I'd say this. If it's a choice between whether someone who's buying a car worth a couple of $100,000 pays a bit of tax, or whether that money's available to assist someone with dementia, I know where my priorities are. And when you look at tax, you've also got to look at expenditure. So our position is that the government should be incredibly embarrassed, frankly, by a government that talks about jobs, including here in Queensland, but essentially literally dared Holden and car manufacturers to lead this country without any recognition of the important role that it plays in a multiplier effect in terms of not just direct jobs, but in the skills and the other activity that is related to the car industry.
Okay, we'll take some questions from the working media now, and the first one's from Sarah Elk.
Sarah Elks from the Australian newspaper. Just back onto the issue of aged care funding. The Health Services Union has proposed a Medicare-style levy to act as a single-payer system for aged care. The HSU says, well, they estimate there's a funding shortfall of somewhere between $5 billion and $40 billion. And they also say that Bill Shorten had failed to properly fund Labor's aged care commitments at the last election. Do you support an aged care levy? And if not, how would Labor fund its aged care promises, given, as you've just said, the system is broken?
Well, we're not proposing a levy. That's not our proposal. I certainly understand why people who are at the coalface in terms of the Health Services Union, people who see every day the pressures are on the system, are concerned about funding models. What we'll do, we've outlined today a very broad vision statement. We'll have more specific policies that are fully costed across the board in the lead up to the next election. Of course, between now and then, you'll have the Aged Care Royal Commission report, and there'll need to be a government response to that. We will be holding the government to account, and we'll of course be having our own response at that time if we see the government's response as being inadequate, which, given the way that they've dismissed many of the findings in the interim report, there's no reason to think that they'll get better down the track.
But just to be clear, you're not ruling out that possibility at this stage?
Well, I'm not playing word games. That's what I'm not doing. It's not on our agenda. We haven't considered it. We're not considering it.
Mark Ludlow from the Financial Review. It's not often a federal politician comes to Queensland and not talk about coal during his speech. Obviously, you're talking about aged care. Labor lost the last election in Queensland on the back of a drubbing over the party's position on coal, especially the Adani mine. You've toured regional Queensland since you've become leader. I just want to find out what lessons you've learned and how is Labor going to win back regional Queensland seats?
Well, one of the things we have to do is to show that we respect workers, whether they be coal workers or in other industries. That's the first thing that we do. We need to listen. And I've been to Cairns, Mackay, Rocky, Bundaberg, Barcaldine, Emerald, Harvey Bay, right throughout the state. I've been down to look at the drought in southern Queensland. There's a whole range of things we need to do better in Queensland, clearly to add to the number of Labor reps that we send to Canberra from this great state. We've got the quality, we don't have the quantity at the moment that I'd like to see. And I'm someone who, there's nothing unusual about me visiting all of those places in Queensland and doing it regularly. I think I can walk into a boardroom or a pub, whether it's in Hughenden with Bob Catter or a boardroom here in Queensland, and talk about the opportunities that are there for business. We need to be, and it's no accident that the first of the statements that I made, vision statements, was about jobs and the future of work. Our priority is jobs, and jobs here in Queensland, and we make no apologies for that.
Alison Horn from ABC News. In your first press conference when you came to Queensland after Labor lost the election, I asked you, do you support the Adani coal mine? You couldn't give me a definitive answer then. Today, can you say what your position is on the Adani mine, and is it a good thing that it's going ahead?
Well, my first press conference was in Mackay. But in terms of the Adani mine, it's been approved. It's a good thing that those jobs are being created. I support jobs regardless of where they are, and that is a very good thing, and I support those jobs and the economic activity that will arise from it.
Michael Ray from the Courier Mail. In your speech, you said that with economic growth and productivity, you can have both higher super and higher wages. At the moment, wages growth has been weak since about 2012. Labour productivity is declining. Is it responsible to raise super before productivity and wages growth improve? And will business be able to afford to pay for both wage rises and extra super?
Well, at the moment, we have a plan from this government that's about low productivity, low wages and no growth in super. That's their plan. You can have all of the above. If you have a look at just empirically, have a look at the period in which you had superannuation ticking up when it was first created under the Labor government. As during that period, you had extremely high productivity growth and you had real wage growth as well. At the moment, if the theory of the Grattan Institutes and others was correct, what you would have seen when the government stalled, the increase from 9.5 going up in increments to 12, you would have seen during that period an increase in wages. That hasn't happened. That hasn't happened. All we've seen is that people's retirement incomes has been undermined. And of course, what we know is that this government, for a long period of time, they used to do it explicitly in the coalition. The Liberal and National parties don't really support superannuation. We saw that with the Royal Commission, whereby they thought it was a good idea to include industry super funds, and they had a look at that, and guess what? Industry super funds were returning rates, and still are, rates of around about 8%, some a bit higher. You go into a bank or a financial institution and say, I want to save for my retirement, can you give me a bank account that'll pay me 8 or 9%? If you find one, let me know. And let everyone know, because everyone will be rushing to the doors there. Industry superannuation has been extremely successful for those people who are members, but importantly, extremely successful as well for our national economy. It's industry super funds that have a share in most of the airports around the country and in other important infrastructure projects, including ports and roads, other projects as well, some rail projects as well. So it adds to the national wealth as well, that $3 trillion. So I think that superannuation is an important part of our economic success. It's provided as well a ballast for our economy at what have been difficult times.
Probably got time for one or two more quick ones before we say goodbye.
Thanks, Lane. Stefano Ambrosta from SBS World News. 2 years ago, Australia signed the Boy Declaration in Nauru with its Pacific nation neighbours. And in that declaration, it stated that the greatest existential threat to the Pacific is climate change. The leaders of the Pacific have called on Australia to permit no more new coal mines and build no more coal-fired power stations. If you became leader of Australia, would you join with your Pacific brothers and sisters and agree to no more new coal mines? And if not, how will you explain that to them?
Well, what I'll do is stand up for Australia's national interest whilst being good neighbours in terms of taking action on climate change. And we will do that both in terms of domestically, but also by being a part of the international community, including with the Pacific. I notice at the moment you have a government that says in its talking points that they're not about taxation when it comes to action on climate change. But they're actually using $4 million of taxpayers' funds to give to a private operation that has no record of building a new power station anywhere. And I see that, frankly, as just hush money for the climate sceptics in the coalition government. There's nothing to stop or to have stopped a new power station or what powered by any source in terms of renewables or coal or gas in this country over the last 7 years. They've been in office. The thing that is stopping it is economics, is the market that is speaking. And that's something that's not about to change. And unless the government and Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison at various times as well have all very explicitly said they do not support government subsidies for a new coal-fired power station. They've said that, not just the people who are more in the moderate side of the Liberal Party. And yet here we have $4 million with no tender, by the way, given to a proponent of a project to undertake a study on the project that it has an interest in going ahead. It's quite remarkable that taxes were raised for that $4 million and everyone in this room who pays tax helped make a contribution to it. So there's a huge gap between the government's rhetoric and what is actually happening on the ground. And one of the things that's happening on the ground is that business and people who look at these issues are making business-based decisions, which is why you need, according to the Australian Industry Group, an indemnity of something like $17 billion. $17 billion of taxpayers' money would be required for a new coal-fired power station, which is why in the past when people have been fair income and just straight with people, they've said that won't be going ahead.
Thanks, Albo. That's probably all the time we have for...
Do we have one more, Lane?
We got time for one more, PK?
Just one on transparency.
Yep.
Michael Doyle, Australian Associated Press. What is your approach to the transparency of government? And with that, do you support a right to information law rather than the freedom of information laws that we have? And do you think that our cabinet meetings or federal cabinet meetings should be more transparent to the public?
It's a different version of those issues. I support freedom of the press. Journalism is not a crime, and I support standing up against the sort of attacks on freedom of the press that we've seen against Annika Smethurst, against the ABC, very clearly. And I think that there should be transparency in government. Genuine cabinet documents, of course, there's a reason why they stay in confidence for a period of time. You know, there could be national security issues, issues of commercial in confidence, reasons whereby you want people around a cabinet table to be able to talk honestly and to put their views in a way that produces good government. And the shadow cabinet I chair, as well as I hope to get to remove that worst word in politics from my perspective is the word shadow from that title. I want people to be able to say what they think without reading about it in the paper the next day. So there's good reasons why you have that. But what we're seeing at the moment is an abuse. The Gagens report is not a cabinet document. It's a farce, frankly, because you have an independent Auditor General's report out there for all to see, and allegedly there's this report that knows better that says there wasn't political decision-making here. I mean, you know, you believe in unicorns if you think that. And there's no reason whatsoever why that document shouldn't be made available. And frankly, it's embarrassing for Mr. Gagens and his credibility that he isn't.
One
Please.
more, Lane.
Oh,
One more.
Okay.
Thanks.
Can you
Lydia
take one
Lynch.
more, Elba? You got time?
I'll be quick.
Quick, very quick.
Lydia Lynch from the Brisbane Times. What do you consider as the biggest hurdle the Labor Party will need to jump over if it wants to win a third term of government here in Queensland at the end of the year? And do you have any advice for Anastasia Palaszczuk on how she can jump that hurdle?
I think Anastasia leads a very good government. And I think that they are a government that have a vision for Queensland, that prioritise jobs. It'd be nice if the federal government actually helped them rather than hinder them by funding projects like Cross River Rail and other projects where they haven't got a fair shake of federal funding. But I think that it's a very good government led by Anastasia very well, that they have very good people, competent people in senior portfolios. And I think that contrasts in terms of character. I don't know the opposition leader here very well, but I think what she said at the end of last year, thinking that was a good way to deal with politics in a personal way against Anastasia Palaszczuk, showed to me that she wasn't fit to be the Premier of this great state.
Please join me in thanking Anthony Albanese.
Thanks, mate.
And again, can we just acknowledge the naming right partners, Brisbane Airport Corporation, Dial Before You Dig, Griffith University, as well as our other event partners. Thank you all for coming. Have a good afternoon.